Imagine this. A woman walks into a doctor's office hoping for help. She fears for her health, but instead of sympathy, she receives humiliation. The doctor, full of contempt, doesn't even try to hide his racism. He refuses to treat her, hurling insults that cut to the heart. But he does not yet know her son is. His misguided sense of superiority is soon replaced by cold terror. What will happen next? Find out in this thrilling story to the end. Friends, now let's get to know each other better. Write in the comments what your name is and what city you're watching this video from. We read every one of your comments, and they are incredibly inspiring to keep going. Your participation is the power that helps our channel grow. Every like, every subscription makes us better. You are not just viewers for us. You are our family. Thank you for being with us. Enjoy the show. Angelica, a slender woman with a kind face but a tired look, hesitantly crossed the threshold of the hospital. Her hands were shaking, and she clutched her bag tightly, as if it would give her strength. Angelica hadn't felt so helpless in a long time. The weakness, the pain in her chest, the dizziness, all of it was becoming unbearable. She needed medical attention, and she hoped that the hospital would help her. At the front desk, the receptionist, an elderly woman named Mary, gave her a form to fill out. Mary seemed to treat all patients the same, with a polite but impassive smile. Angelica, breathing heavily, sat her down on an uncomfortable plastic chair in the corner of the waiting room. The smell of antiseptics lingered in the room, mingling with the noise of ventilation and muffled voices. A little later, Dr. Richard Hill appeared in the hallway. Tall, with gray hair slicked back neatly, he wore a white coat that fit him perfectly. His face expressed a cold severity and his eyes an undisguised contempt. He cast a fleeting glance at Angelica, and the depth of his dislike was clear in his gaze. Dr. Hill hummed faintly, noticing who was sitting in the corner of the waiting room. His gaze lingered on Angelica's dark skin, and his lips curved into a faint chuckle. He said nothing, but the tense atmosphere in the room was almost palpable. Angelica felt that looked like a stab in the back. She felt uncomfortable, but she decided not to give in to fear. She had no choice. Clenching her fists, she stood up and walked to the counter to see when she would be admitted. "I'm sorry, how much longer do we have to wait?" she asked Mary with a weak smile. Mary glanced briefly at the computer. "Dr. Hill will be free in 15 minutes, she replied, avoiding a direct look, but Angelica could already feel Richard's cold gaze on her. He had obviously heard their conversation. The doctor was standing in the hallway talking to a nurse, but he kept glancing furtively at the woman, as if assessing her. His voice suddenly sounded louder. "Who's next? Mary, is it that random stream again?" he asked, defiantly ignoring Angelica's presence. Angelica felt tears come to her eyes. She was scared, but she forced herself to stay. She didn't know that this was only the beginning. When it was Angelica's turn, Mary nodded timidly, inviting her into Dr. Hill's office. Angelica felt a heavy lump of anxiety lodge in her throat. She took a deep breath to control her fear and entered. The office was sterile white, almost oppressive in its cold cleanliness. Dr. Hill was sitting at his desk, staring at his computer. When he heard the footsteps, he looked up, his face contorted with a grimace of displeasure. "Sit down," he said briefly, not even trying to hide his irritation. Angelica sank quietly into the chair opposite. Her weakness was even more noticeable, her breathing heavy, but she tried to speak. "Doctor, I have severe chest pain. I think there's something wrong with my breathing. I'm very," she started, but her voice shook. Dr. Hill raised his hand sharply, silencing her. He said, looking her over from head to toe. "How long have you been walking like that? Or did you only decide to come here when it got bad?" Angelica frowned. She felt his words like thorns digging into her soul. "I didn't have a chance before," she started to justify herself. But Hale interrupted her. "Of course." He grinned. "I hear that every day. But you know that prevention is part of the responsibility, right? Or do you expect someone else to do it for you?" His voice was drenched in icy sarcasm, but his gaze became even colder. He opened her medical records and took a quick look at the notes. "Address? What neighborhood is this?" he asked suddenly, looking up. Angelica was confused. "That's the west side of town," she answered quietly. "Oh, I see," Hale said with a sneer. "What else do you expect? Is this how you all live? Get yourselves cleaned up, then come to us." His words hit harder than she could have expected. Angelica felt a chill run down her spine. She clutched the bag tighter, trying not to show how shocked she was. "Doctor, I just wanted to," she began. But Hale interrupted her again. "Harder now. I hear you," he said sharply, pushing the computer away. "But let's be honest. Are you sure you've come to the right place? Because this is a hospital, not a free clinic for people who don't respect themselves." Angelica was stunned into silence, but inside her everything was trembling. "You know, I don't understand why we waste resources on people who don't take care of their own health. If I had a choice, I'd probably focus on more meaningful patients." He put emphasis on the word significant, making it clear that he didn't see her as worthy of anything. Angelica felt her eyes begin to fill with tears, but she did not allow herself to cry. She only asked quietly, "So, you don't want to help me, doctor?" Hale stood up from the table, folded his arms across his chest, and looked down at her disdainfully. "I haven't decided yet. I need to figure out if it's worth my time," he replied with a chuckle. His words, his tone, his gaze, all of it robbed her of her last strength. She wanted to get up and leave, but she realized she needed treatment. Her condition was worsening, but facing this man seemed worse than the disease. Angelica, shocked by the doctor's rudeness, could hardly keep from running out of the office. Her heart was beating so hard that she thought she might pass out. Dr. Hale seemed to be enjoying the situation, watching her reaction as if he were conducting an experiment. "Actually, I'm very busy right now," he said coldly, glancing at the computer monitor as if distracted by something more important. "But you can wait." He paused theatrically and looked at his watch. "Say, a couple hours." "A couple hours?" Angelica barely audibly questioned, not believing her ears. "Yeah," Hale grinned. "We've got real patients here, you know, who need my attention. And you, well, maybe I should reprioritize, if you insist." He turned to Mary, who was standing nearby, glancing nervously at the situation but doing nothing. "Mary, put this lady at the end of the list," he said with a note of disdain. She still needed time to think about how to answer questions about her habits and responsibilities. Angelica tried to protest. "Doctor, I'm very sick. I can't wait that long." Hale raised his eyebrows and crossed his arms over his chest. "You can't?" he asked, stretching his words. "Maybe you should look for another place where you can be accepted right away. Good luck with that, though. I'm sure you'll be welcomed with open arms in such places." His voice was soaked with sarcasm and contempt. He turned his back and started typing something on the keyboard. As if Angelique no longer existed for him, she stood at a loss, feeling her eyes fill with tears. She was ashamed to cry in front of this man who enjoyed her humiliation. "Listen," Hale said suddenly, speaking again without turning around. "You have to understand, my time is money, and helping people like you is more like charity, but I'm not sure you appreciate it." Those words sounded like a final blow. Clenching her teeth, Angelica walked out of the office, feeling his every word echoing in her soul. She returned to the waiting room, where all eyes seemed to be fixed on her. She sat her down on the same plastic chair, feeling breathless with shame, anger, and humiliation. Time dragged on for an agonizingly long time. Each new patient came in to see Hale, and she continued to sit there, ignored, as if she didn't exist. More than an hour had passed. Angelica felt weakness take over her body. She approached the front desk again. "Please, I'm not feeling very well. Maybe the doctor can see me sooner," she asked in a low voice. Mary looked at her with an expression of pity, but as if afraid to disobey the doctor, replied, "I'm sorry, but doctor, Hale said he's busy right now. Can you wait?" Angelica nodded slowly, realizing that she simply had no other choice. Hale reappeared in the hallway. He glanced at her, but didn't slow down as he walked past with a folder in his hands. "Is she still here?" He tossed to Mary, loud enough for Angelica to hear. "Amazing. Well, let's see how much patience people like her have." He walked away, leaving a heavy silence behind him. Angelica felt something in her begin to break. After 2 long hours of agonizing waiting, Angelica felt her strength leaving her. She felt dizzy and weak, but she continued to sit, clutching her bag so tightly that her fingers turned white. Finally, Mary hesitantly called out to her, "Doctor, Hale can see you now." Angelica rose slowly. She could hardly feel her legs, but she tried to hold on as she made her way to the office. She felt the air in the room grow thicker and colder. Dr. Hale was sitting at his desk, poring over papers. without even looking at her. He nodded to the chair across from her. "Sit down," he said with icy indifference. Angelica obediently sat her down, trying not to show how difficult it was for her. "Well," he said, finally looking up, "what have we got today?" His tone was so cold and dismissive that it took her breath away. "I have, severe chest pain, and it's hard to breathe. And also," she started. Yeah, he interrupted, rolling his eyes. "Standard said. Nothing new." Angelica was confused, but continued. "This has been going on for a few days now, and I thought I could handle it, but..." "Handle it?" he suddenly interrupted sharply. "Really? Do you think coming here, when things are already messed up, is the right thing to do? Or did you just think I had nothing better to do than save people like you?" He said the last words with such sarcasm that it took Angelica's breath away. "Like me?" she asked with a tremor in her voice, not believing her ears. "Yes," Hale answered sharply, looking down at her frankly. "People who don't take care of themselves. Someone else might have been able to avoid this situation. But no, it's easier for you to let it go." His words struck like a whip. Angelica felt tears coming to her eyes, but she held back. She was too proud to let him see her weakness. "I came for help," she said firmly, trying not to shiver. "Doctor," Hale snorted. "Help? Shouldn't we start with self-respect first? Or is that too complicated a concept?" His eyes flashed with contempt. Angelica was silent, clenching her teeth. She felt her anger boiling inside her, but fear and weakness kept it from coming out. "Okay, let's take a look," he said, pulling out a stethoscope. "Though I doubt it will be worth my effort." He approached her carelessly, as if he were afraid to touch her. His movements were abrupt and rough, as if he were working with an inanimate object rather than a patient. "Take a deep breath," he tossed. Angelica made an attempt to inhale, but the pain was too much. "You can't even do that properly," he said sharply, pulling away. "Of course. What did I expect?" He tossed the stethoscope on the table and turned away. "Frankly, I don't see the point in continuing. Your condition is the result of your own inaction, and now you come here expecting me to fix it." His voice grew louder, filled with obvious anger. "Maybe you should think about how you live your life before you ask for help. Or maybe you just don't have habits like taking care of your health. This is probably too complicated." Angelica sat stunned by his words. Her heart was beating so fast that it felt like it was about to jump out of her chest. "I don't deserve to be treated like this," she said quietly, barely holding back tears. "Whether you deserve anything is another question," Hale said coldly, looking down at her. "So, what are you going to do next? Stay here and waste my time? Or maybe find someone willing to listen to your excuses?" His words were the last straw. Angelica realized that she couldn't stay in that office any longer, but she couldn't afford to leave. She needed help, or the consequences could be catastrophic. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, raising her head. "Doctor," Hale squinted, but remained silent. There was a tension in the air that was ready to break the silence. Angelica, clenching her fists so that her nails dug into her palms, forced herself to speak. Her voice was weak, but it had determination in it. "Dr. Hale, I understand you have a lot of patience and not a lot of time, but I'm really sick. I came here because I need help. I'm entitled to it." Hale, standing by the table, turned to her as if she'd said something incredibly stupid. He squinted, folded his arms across his chest, and laughed, dryly and mockingly. "Right," he stretched out sarcastically. "Everyone has rights now, but your responsibilities," he emphasized the word, "always end up with just showing up here and waiting to be rescued." Angelica felt those words hurt her pride. "I pay taxes like everyone else," she continued, trying to remain calm, though her voice shook. "I'm a citizen, like the other patients in this hospital." Taxes," Hale interrupted her again, leaning back in his chair. "That's an argument. I'm sure your contributions are substantial." He emphasized the word, clearly implying something derogatory. "But let's be honest, you probably only came here because other places had already refused to take you, didn't you?" Angelica felt anger spill over her body. "That's not true," she said, looking up at him. "I came here because it was the closest hospital, and I thought it would help me." "Help you?" he repeated, shaking his head. "And you seriously think you deserve help when you didn't even bother to show up on time?" He moved closer again, as if wanting to suppress her completely. "Do you think that your presence here obligates me to treat you? Do you think your mistakes and neglect of yourself are my problem now?" Angelica took a deep breath to calm down, but instead of relief, she felt pain piercing her chest. She grabbed a chair to keep from falling and looked at the doctor pleadingly. "Doctor, I'm really sick. I feel like I'm getting worse." But Hale only frowned, as if she were faking it. "Naturally," he said dryly. "That's what you all say when you've reached the tipping point. It's called consequences. Maybe next time you'll think twice before you start your health." Angelica trembled with anger and humiliation. She wanted to scream, but the fear of being denied help for good held her back. "I'm just asking you to watch me," she said, barely containing her emotions. "See for yourself," he said, taking a small device from the shelf. "Here, take your blood pressure. I'm sure you'll be fine." He tossed the device on the table with it looked like it was doing her a favor. Angelica felt herself getting dizzy. Her temples throbbed as if from internal pressure, and her throat constricted from repressed emotions. She knew she had to do something, but in this situation, every attempt at defense only made things worse. "Ew," he said suddenly, pointing his finger at her. "Live with that attitude and then wonder why no one wants to help you. Why don't you start taking responsibility instead of demanding it? Or is that too difficult for you, too?" His words sounded like gunshots, shattering the last vestiges of her confidence. Angelica felt her strength running out, but she couldn't let herself give up. She looked him straight in the eye. Despite the trembling in her body, "I'm not leaving until you hear me out," she said, trying to keep her voice firm. "Doctor," Hale laughed again, his laugh full of contempt. "You really think you're dictating terms to me? Well, let's see how long you have the strength to sit here and wait." "Doctor," Hale stood up from the table, thumping his palm loudly on the wooden surface so that small objects bounced slightly. His face darkened and his voice became harsh, almost shouting. "You know, I'm sick of wasting my time with useless conversations." Angelica recoiled, feeling the anger and humiliation rising in her with renewed vigor. "You sit here demanding something," he continued, pointing his finger at her. "But not once have you even considered that maybe you don't deserve that help." "Why do you say that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm a human being. I'm sick." "Human?" Hale interrupted her with a snort. "People like you come here with the same thing, complaints, tears, and excuses. Maybe it's time you realize that medicine is a privilege, not a right." Angelica felt her breathing grow heavier. Those words cut like knives. "You're a doctor," she said, gathering the last of her strength. "You're supposed to help people, not humiliate them." But Hale only seemed to get more angry. Should I?" he interjected, raising his voice. "You should have thought of that earlier. And you know what? I don't have to help you if you can take care of yourself. It's not my duty to fix your mistakes." He turned to Mary, who was standing at the door, clearly confused. "Mary," he shouted, "call security. This woman doesn't realize she's not welcome here." "Security?" Angelica asked in a daze, feeling her legs go wobbly. "For what?" "For wasting my time and disturbing order," shouted Hale. "You think I'm going to sit here and listen to you cry? I have patients who really deserve attention." Mary frowned, hesitating to move from her seat. "Come on," Hale added with obvious irritation, "or shall I do it myself?" Angelica tried to maintain the remnants of her dignity. "You can just kick me out," she said, trying to keep her voice firm. "I came here for help. I can, and I will," he replied with a chuckle. "People like you only come to cause trouble. You don't even realize you're taking someone else's place." The words "people like you" sounded especially loud, as if he had emphasized them on purpose. "Is it because of my skin color?" Angelica asked, her voice full of pain and anger. Hale squinted his eyes and leaned closer and said quietly, but with a clear threat, "Did I say something like that? You made it up because you know it's true." Those words broke Angelica completely. She tried to get up, but her legs shook. "You'd better leave before I make you do it by force." He threw one last time. Mary took a step forward, but Hale stopped her with a gesture. "No, Mary, let her do it." It's time she realized that sometimes there are consequences in life. Angelica, struggling to stay on her feet, slowly made her way toward the exit. With each passing second, the feeling of humiliation and injustice overwhelmed her, but she knew it was useless to argue. When she left the office, she felt tears running down her cheeks. The patients in the waiting room looked at her, but no one dared to say a word. She lowered her head and hurried toward the exit, wishing she could get out of this place as soon as possible. And behind me came Hale's dry, mocking voice. "Another heroine who thinks the whole world owes her something. Well, we'll see where she ends up next." Angelica left the office, with a firm decision never to return to this hospital again. Her legs could barely hold up her body, which seemed exhausted not only by the physical pain, but also by the humiliation she had endured. With every step down the hospital corridor, with every glance from the other patients, who seemed to see everything, she felt the emptiness inside grow. Her heart was pounding, but the pain in her chest already seemed almost insignificant against the backdrop of what she was experiencing. She had come here hoping for help, and she left with the feeling that she had become another victim of this world. But there was something else, something that seemed more and more important with every step she took. She couldn't leave it in her mind, couldn't forget what she was hiding, a secret that Dr. Hell had never found out. Angelica hadn't told him who her son was, and it was important. Maybe she was afraid that if she said his name, she would give in to her anger and pain even more. Maybe she just wanted him to realize that what she was going through was not empty words, but something much more serious. Her son was a commander in the army, a young, successful officer who fought for his country. He was the pride of the family. He grew up loving and respecting people, no matter their color, creed, or nationality. But most of all, he was a man who always fought for justice. Angelica herself had told him more than once that he should watch his behavior, that the world wasn't always as he might have imagined it to be, and he had listened to her. He was one of the few who never raised his head in the presence of people whose views were limited to racial prejudice. He knew his path would be difficult, but he walked it with pride and honor. But now, as she left the hospital, she found it hard not to think about how Hell would react if he found out who her son was. What would he think if he realized that the man he had so grossly insulted and hurt was someone among his most hated enemies? Angelica didn't know what to do with that thought, but there was one thing she was sure of. She wouldn't tell him. Let this be his lesson. Let Hell himself reap what he sowed. He didn't know that someone near him held such an important title, and that knowledge, that secret, stayed with her. Her steps became firmer. She stepped outside, and the cold wind hit her face. Second by second, it was as if the hospital itself was behind her, and with it the resentment she carried. She inhaled deeply, clenching her fingers, and remembered again that important person, her son. He might never even know about what had happened to her today, but she knew it didn't matter. He would understand why she was silent. A few days passed after Angelica left the hospital, but the memory of that terrible incident would not let her go. She tried to forget, but every night brought new nightmares, and every morning reminded her of how cruelly she had been humiliated. And all the while, in the back of her mind, she knew that there would come a moment when it would not go without consequences. The young man who stood for justice knew that his mother had always skirted the sharp corners. He knew that she never complained, never asked for help, and that her patience was almost limitless. But she wouldn't have been his mother if she hadn't hidden from him that day how rudely and humiliatingly she had been treated at the hospital. It was her silence. His was an outburst of rage. When Jason, Angelica's son, found out about the incident, his anger exploded with such force that she didn't have time to warn him that it was going to be bad. He was sitting in his office, in his luxurious office, watching the news when he happened to stumble upon a social media post. An elderly man, one of those who had been at the hospital that day, posted a video of Angelica sitting in his office, his contemptuous words recorded and his mother's face contorted in pain and humiliation. It was a fragment of a life Jason didn't want to see. His palm pressed into the screen of the phone, and he threw it down on the desk with force. The glass didn't crack, but his rage was so devastating that everything in the office seemed inconsequential for a moment. Everything he knew, everything he had built over the years became unimportant. No accomplishments, no victories in his career meant as much as his mother and his personal sense of justice. This man will not be forgiven, he whispered, and his voice was low, threatening. Jason rose from the table, his eyes burning. He dialed his assistant's number quickly, giving instructions with such determination that even the man next to him felt the weight of his words. "Contact my lawyers," he said, each syllable sounding like a sentence. "I want this hospital to pay for what they did to my mother. Make it not just a trial, but real punishment for everyone involved in this case." He hung up the phone, but felt no relief. Instead, he felt even more furious. "That doctor," he muttered, "he'll get what he deserves. I will not be silent any longer." Jason was a successful and influential man. His name was known in circles where destinies were decided. In the army, in business, Among politicians, he wasn't just another officer, it was a leader, a man who was respected, who knew how to solve problems, how to get obstacles out of the way, and now he was to be the one to remove the most dangerous obstacles for his mother. He didn't know all the details of what had happened in Hale's office, but he was certain that this doctor would not get away with it. He realized he had the power and resources in his hands to destroy this man's career if he so desired. But Jason wasn't set on just destroying it. He wanted Hale to feel what real fear was. He shrank back, clenching his fists. "I promise you, Mom," he said quietly to himself, "that this man will not go unpunished. Let him pay for his insolence and contempt. Let him feel what it's like to be humiliated. Let this be his lesson." With each word, his anger only grew, and he knew he wouldn't back down this time. Dr. Hale Saturday in his office, wiping his glasses and wondering how he could best spend the rest of the day. His mind raced with thoughts of the patients he had recently served, of what he could do to avoid unnecessary contact with those he did not consider worthy. The workday had been long and tiring, and he finally decided it was time to relax a little, to switch to something lighter. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by the sharp ringing of the telephone. He didn't pick it up right away, setting his glasses aside and glancing irritably at the screen. The display showed an unfamiliar number. As always, he thought it might be another commercial call or some minor annoyance, but not putting it off, he picked up the phone nevertheless. "Dr. Hale," the voice on the other end was confident, with a touch of authority. "Hi, this is Jason Stewart. We have an important conversation to have with you. We'd like you to see a very important patient." Dr. Hale frowned for a moment. The name was familiar, but he couldn't remember where he'd heard it. He quickly thought of his options. Jason Stewart. Could it be someone in the local government or a big businessman he'd treated before? He sighed, deciding not to waste time thinking about it. This was a chance to get a valuable patient, and such cases did not come up often in his practice. "Of course, I'm glad you chose our hospital," he said, trying to hide his slight agitation. "We provide the highest level of medical care. Please tell me more about the patient." The voice on the other end of the phone was in no hurry to reveal details. He continued to speak in a cold and confident manner that all sounded very professional. "We're counting on your skill and experience. Doctor, the patient is unlikely to be in your office for long, but we're confident you'll be up to the task. Just be prepared. This is a serious man." Hale felt a slight wave of pride. He was used to respect, used to being valued not just for his experience, but for his status. The man on the other side of the wire clearly knew who he was dealing with, and although things were a bit mysterious, the doctor felt this was his chance. "Of course I'm ready. Bring the patient in, and I'll do my best to help," he said, smoothing his voice a little to sound more convincing. "We'll call you back when we have an exact time," Jason answered, and was silent for a moment. "Thank you for your cooperation, Doctor. We're sure you won't disappoint us." Hale hung up the phone and breathed a sigh of relief. He was flattered. It sounded as if his position in society and his professional qualities had finally been recognized at the highest level. He was sure that this new patient would be not only a professional, but also a personal triumph for him. However, the feeling of pride was quickly replaced by anxiety. This didn't seem like a normal challenge. Who was this man, and why was this so important? Hale tried to push those thoughts away, convincing himself that this was just another professional opportunity he couldn't pass up. But with each passing minute, he was becoming more and more uncomfortable. He looked out the window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade away. A strange uneasiness swept over him, like a portent of something bad. He wasn't about to let those thoughts overwhelm him. However, as always, he was sure he could handle it. But when the call from Jason went off again, and his name popped up on the phone screen, Hale couldn't have expected what he was about to hear. Dr. Hale was sitting in his office, trying to gather his thoughts, when the doors opened and a man entered the office. His figure was confident, calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Hale hesitate for a moment. This man did not look like an ordinary patient. He was in a strict suit, with smooth, hard features and a penetrating gaze that immediately captured everyone's attention. There was a confidence in his movements that had nothing to do with medical care. He seemed not just a client, but a man on whom someone's fate depended. Dr. Hale stood up, but his hand frowned in midair, as he noticed that the man was in no hurry to approach the chair. Instead, He looked at the doctor calmly, and there was something frightening in his eyes. "Dr. Hale," said a man with a clear, firm voice. "I'm Jason Stewart." The doctor frowned. See, the name now seemed to echo in his head. Jason Stewart. That voice was the voice from the phone call. It was the man who had arranged for him to meet with the important patient. But something wasn't right. Jason wasn't who Hale had expected to see. Stewart's gaze was cold and weary, like a man who knows more than others and has already drawn conclusions. Dr. Hale stood there, not knowing what to say. His confidence, which had been so proudly embodied in his brazen refusal to help the woman, evaporated in an instant. He felt everything inside him clench as panic began to creep up slowly. "I heard," Stewart continued, "that you recently hosted a close relative of mine, my mother." Realizing where this was going, Hale felt the blood drain from his face. It was a moment when all his ideas about the order of things, his confidence that he was always right, came crashing down. This man's mother, the woman he had so cruelly insulted and humiliated, was not just a patient. This was the mother of someone who had power and influence enough to destroy his life with a single word. Hale slowly sat back in his chair, feeling his body lose its former steadiness. His eyes darted around the office, but his gaze could not settle on one object. He tried to find words, but all he could get out were incoherent sounds. I didn't know that she was your mother," he said, his voice trembling. He could feel the cold sweat running down his back. It was like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Stewart took his time answering, his gaze becoming sharper and sharper, like a knife blade. He stepped closer and stopped in front of Hale, his voice deep, steady, and threatening. "Wasn't it enough for you to humiliate and insult my mother? You thought you could do anything you wanted to her and no one would judge you?" His words fell on Hale like heavy hammers. Dr. Hale felt his heart racing. This man didn't look like someone who would allow himself to lose. He was certain that his mother not only deserved an apology, but justice. Hale couldn't help but notice that Stewart's gaze was full of determination. This man was ready to fight, and there was no doubt that his fight would be fierce. I apologize," Hale said, his voice now sounding like a weak attempt to regain lost credibility. "I didn't know who she was. I shouldn't have done that to her. You see, I made a mistake." But Stewart only grinned, and that grin was empty, ruthless. "Wrong," he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "It's more like systematic humiliation. You didn't just make a mistake. You acted as if you had the right to view people from the height of your own self-righteousness and contempt. And I'm sure your mistake will now be corrected." Stewart stepped forward, and Hale felt his body grow heavy. He knew something terrible was coming. All these days, these weeks, when he thought he was out of any situation, were now bearing down on him. Stewart continued to stare at him, and Hale suddenly realized that his life would never be the same. "If I were you," Stewart said, "I'd be packing my bags by now, because from now on, your mistakes are going to cost you more than you could ever imagine." A tension hung in the room, as if the air had grown heavy, and every look, every movement was calculated. Jason Stewart stayed close to the doctor, his figure standing like a stone wall, and there was something burning in his eyes that Dr. Hale couldn't ignore. He felt his own confidence crumbling, all his accomplishments built on arrogance and racist beliefs, now coming down on his head like bricks from a collapsed wall. "I'm not going to let you get away with this, Doctor." His voice was quiet, but there was a threat in it that Hale couldn't hide from. "I'm going to make sure the whole world knows about your behavior, how you humiliated my mother, and how it affected the lives of those who were hoping for your help." Dr. Hale, feeling his pride melt away, tried to justify himself, but his words sounded like pathetic attempts to defend something that no longer made sense. I didn't know who she was," Hale almost whispered, but Stewart didn't let him continue. "Don't try to justify yourself," Jason interrupted him, his eyes as sharp as knives. "Your apologies aren't worth the paper they're written on. They can't erase the pain you caused my mother, and more importantly, they can't change what you did." With every word he said, Hale felt his world shrinking, the center of his own nightmare. He'd always thought himself superior, thought his position as a doctor gave him the right to look down on people, to decide who was worthy of treatment and who wasn't. But now the world was collapsing, and it didn't know how to find a way out. "You will be held accountable for your words and your actions," Jason continued, his voice growing as hard as steel. "But I'm not going to let you do it quietly, as if nothing happened. I'm going to let everyone know that this doctor, this man, with humiliation and racism, with contempt and hatred, denied people the right to treatment. Dr. Hale felt his throat constrict as his breathing became heavy. He knew this wasn't just a conversation. Jason Stewart was determined. The man was ready for revenge, to make Hale pay for his atrocity. And now the only thing the doctor could feel was a growing remorse that was becoming as heavy as a stone in his chest. He realized that there was no room for excuses, that his mistakes could no longer be hidden. I realize what I've done, but I need time, he said, trying to say the words that couldn't bring back the trust he lost. Time. Jason leaned forward, his face even more serious. Time won't bring back what you took from my mother. She wasn't just your patient. She's a human being, just like you, and she had every right to expect respect from you. Not only did you violate professional standards, you violated her dignity, and now I'm gonna make you answer for it. Hale felt his knees buckle as he lost confidence in his abilities. He knew he couldn't stop what was happening now. What had seemed insignificant a few days ago was now a disaster of his own making. I'm willing to suffer the consequences. He breathed out, his voice sounding hoarse. But please give me a chance to make this right. I didn't mean for this to happen. Jason Stewart didn't say a word. He simply opened the office door and gestured for Hale to follow him. You don't need to apologize, he said as they walked out into the hallway. You will have to answer for your actions in public. Everyone needs to know what kind of man you are, and let that be a lesson not only to you, but to anyone who thinks they can do what you do. Hale realized he no longer had a way out. Everything he had built, all his accomplishments, his career, the respect of his colleagues, now it was at risk. With every step he took, he felt his life changing, and the full weight of his remorse fell on his shoulders, giving him no chance to justify himself. The price of racism was too high, and now Hale had to pay for his mistakes. The noise of the hospital corridor became deafening to Dr. Hale as he followed Jason Stewart, feeling every step echo in his chest. Every look he caught from nurses and co-workers was full of judgment and silent contempt. Hale felt his reputation crumbling right before his eyes, his own pride turning to dust. We're not doing this on the sly, Jason said as they approached one of the open rooms. He stopped and turned to the doctor, his face serious now, without emotion. I want everyone to see who you really are. The doctors, the nurses, the patients, everyone needs to know what kind of person you are. This is not just a lesson for you. It's a lesson for everyone who forgets that human dignity is above all your so-called merits. Hale felt his cheeks begin to burn with shame. He was on edge, and every word Jason said hit him like a hammer against hot steel. He tried to suppress the feeling of despair, but it still took over. What he'd done was not forgivable. He had humiliated a woman he considered beneath him for not living up to his standards, and now he had to pay for it. Jason continued, his voice now sounding like inevitable judgment. We'll make it public. No one will forget what you did, Dr. Hale, because people need to know who's really behind the white coat, behind the title. When you decide who lives and who doesn't, you have to remember that everyone is entitled to respect. Hale looked into Jason's eyes and realized that he wasn't going to send him to forgive him. His mistake was too big. It couldn't be covered up, glossed over, or pretended that things would go back to the way they were. All he deserved now was punishment. He couldn't take away the feeling of bitterness and shame that was building up inside. The career he'd been marching on for so long was crumbling right in front of him. At that moment he realized racism destroyed not only the lives of others, but also his own. His prejudice and arrogance had brought him to a complete collapse. Everything he'd been proud of, everything he'd considered his strength, his place in medicine, his status, his respect among his peers, now it was all gone. The look in Jason's eyes, his certainty that Hale was now part of the story, seemed unbearable to him, and he knew it was a lesson he would always remember. I know what I've done, he said with difficulty, realizing that every word he said was now void. But you don't understand. I was blind. But Jason wouldn't let him continue. Blind, yes, and probably overconfident. But, doctor, you're not just gonna be treating people anymore. You're gonna be treating your conscience. I don't want to hear any more excuses. From now on, all you have to do is live with the consequences. He nodded to the hospital staff waiting at the door, and Dr. Hale felt his world finally crumble. He was no longer a respected physician. His star had faded, and now he was to take off his white coat and leave the world where self-confidence and bias had caused his downfall. In that second, He realized that this wasn't just a lesson he had learned. It was a lesson he would remember forever, and there was no one who could erase the marks left in his life. This was the price he had to pay for his mistakes. Friends, what do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced racism? Or perhaps you have witnessed such situations? We really want to hear your opinions and what you think about the importance of fighting bias and discrimination. You are an integral part of our channel, and we appreciate each and every one of you. You support us, and it is thanks to you that we continue to do what we love. Your likes and subscriptions are a great support that helps us develop our content and make it even better. Don't forget to give us a like, subscribe if you liked the video, and wish everyone a good day. We are always happy to have you on our channel.